everyone, and welcome back to The Wire. My name is Gabe Caligiuri. It is good to be back in the studio after a few weeks on the road throughout Europe, mostly in Italy. And big news, obviously, today for those of you who follow The Wire on social media, you know that the Israeli military has begun its ground offensive in the Gaza Strip, or at least some form of it. The IDF is hedging somewhat and saying this isn't the big expected offensive, but nonetheless, it's very clear to those in the area who are reporting and by the IDF's own admission that thousands of Israeli troops are now on the ground in Gaza. Dozens of tanks and APCs, armored personnel carriers, are now operating in the area, attack helicopters. So in whatever form it is taking so far, and in whatever we want to call it, Israel is on the ground and moving in Gaza. There had been several incursions over the past week, almost like guerrilla strikes, where the IDF came in and achieved some sort of objective to soften the ground or possibly take out key targets in Hamas leadership, and then drew back. But now it seems that there is a sustained Israeli presence on the ground in Gaza. The incursion points were both in the northern Gaza Strip and also in the central Gaza Strip around a so-called refugee settlement. So I think it's important to remember in this conflict that, and the IDF has said as much, that we're looking at something that's going to take months, not days or weeks. And so we shouldn't expect to see 250,000 Israeli soldiers just flood the entire Gaza Strip in a couple of days. This is going to be a very difficult battle. Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the 12 other jihadist organizations that are active in the Strip have entrenched themselves there for almost 20 years and are very deeply rooted and have a very elaborate system of tunnels and have no doubt ensconced themselves all over the civilian population and built booby traps and all sorts of things. So we can expect to see the IDF move methodically and intentionally, but somewhat slowly. And this will be a multi-phased, multi-staged operation. So it is undoubtedly begun. What form it will take, how far it will go is yet to be seen. Obviously, the reaction around the world has already been pronounced. We saw over 100,000 marching on the streets of London today. By some counts, over 1 million people rallied in Istanbul to listen to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The IDF also reinforcing its fronts in the north along the Lebanese and Syrian borders, and also along the so-called Red Line, the West Bank 1967 border, and its operations inside the West Bank have stepped up as well. As we've reported on The Wire multiple times over the past few months, there's been a growing concern, a growing presence of jihadist organizations in the West Bank, particularly Hamas and Islamic Jihad in places like Jenin and Nablus, and even in Ramallah, the capital of the West Bank. And so ever since the beginning of this war on October 7th, the IDF has been stepping up its operations in the West Bank to try to proactively quell any kind of uprising that may come, or any kind of intifada or new front of this war that may come from the West Bank. So there's already been over 1,000 arrests of jihadists, Hamas and Islamic Jihad members, both those who didn't make it back to the Gaza Strip, and also hundreds in the West Bank as well. A very large operation in Jenin a couple of days ago that involved dozens of vehicles, hundreds of troops, another operation inside Ramallah yesterday. So the IDF is doing everything it can in the West Bank to prevent that from opening up as another front. Huge marches throughout the West Bank last night and today as the Gaza offensive kicked off, and calls to arms across the West Bank. So things are very unsettled there right now, and the IDF is doing what it can to keep a lid on things. Up in the north has been more of the same. Hezbollah and Palestinian groups in Lebanon, such as Hamas, has a presence there, have been meeting in Beirut, in the capital of Lebanon, have been coordinating with one another. Hezbollah has still not opened a new, what we could say, front of this war. They've been nibbling around the edges. They've been firing missiles and anti-tank missiles into Israel on a daily basis. They've killed at least half a dozen IDF personnel so far and a civilian. The IDF has been responding every day with airstrikes and drone strikes and artillery fire, tank fire, and have killed close to 40 Hezbollah operatives so far. So definitely tense, and there is a battle going on in the north, so to speak, but it's not what we would expect to be if Hezbollah were to push all in on this conflict, and they have not yet so far. Iran has, in the last 24 hours, rattled its sabers, publishing videos of missiles firing and claiming that they're about to enter the conflict and directly engage Israel with its missile arsenal. We have not seen that yet. We're still less than 24 hours into this offensive, so it could take a few days or weeks for things to play out, but Iran is definitely claiming that it's going to escalate its conflict with Israel. It's yet to be seen how or when that will happen. Back to Gaza, one of the biggest considerations in this conflict is going to be the continued presence of about 230 Israeli hostages, men, women, and children. Hamas released 4 adults, and there were reportedly negotiations underway through Qatar as a third party to negotiate the release of at least the dual citizens that are held there, about 150 people. I'm sorry, about 50 people. Those talks fell through, and it was reported that when those talks fell through yesterday, that was when Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet made the decision to go into Gaza. That doesn't mean hostage negotiations are over, and obviously the top priority of IDF personnel inside Gaza right now, especially special forces who may be operating together with, we know, American special forces in the area who were deployed to the area, their top priority will be to rescue hostages. So in the meantime, Hamas, PIJ, and the other groups in Gaza continue to fire rockets into Israel, over 7,000 so far in the last 3 weeks since the war began. Iron Dome has been doing an excellent job of intercepting most of these rockets that are at least on the trajectory to land in urban or suburban areas. It's not 100%. We do see incidents every day of rockets hitting civilian areas. For instance, a residential apartment building was struck by a rocket near Tel Aviv in the community of Rishon LeZion, injuring 3 people. So that is a daily concern. For everything that Hamas says that they're running out of in the Gaza Strip, it certainly seems that they aren't running out of rockets, and that continues to be a daily threat for Israelis throughout half of the country, most of the country actually. Besides that, obviously the ripple effects of this new offensive are being felt around the world. I mentioned Recep Tayyip Erdogan's speech in Istanbul yesterday that seems to have gathered a crowd of about 100, at least 1 million people, maybe 1.5 million is what the AK party is claiming. We don't really know if that's true or not. I want to highlight some things that Erdogan said during that speech that I think are really important for us to consider, especially considering Turkey's future prophetic role, we believe, in the time of Jacob's trouble and the Great Tribulation. Erdogan's speech, I think, in many ways can be compared to Hitler's Nuremberg speech in the 1930s. I want to say it's 1935, 1936. I could be wrong about that. That speech is often looked back at as being a speech in which Hitler laid out his modus operandi, laid out his philosophy, laid out his objectives, even if they were somewhat couched, made his threats against his opponents. And at that time, the world either didn't take him seriously or was even somewhat supportive of his objectives, at least in as much as they were for the restoration of the German people. And of course, post-war, looking back, we can see that the warning signs were all there, going all the way back to Nuremberg. So one thing I want to suggest is that Erdogan's speech in Istanbul today in many ways mirrors that Nuremberg speech. Some quotes from that speech. Asking the Western world if they want another war of the Crescent and the Crusaders. In other words, are you ready to fight another crusade? And making it clear that Turkey is alive, it's not dead, and it's standing up or it's upright, it's ready to fight such a war against the West. This is a NATO partner, the leader of a NATO partner country saying these things. Threatening that we can come at any night unexpectedly. Same threat he made against Greece in a dispute over some islands a few months ago. Now he's threatening the entire Western world, saying we can come at any night unexpectedly, which was met with chants from the crowd of Turkish militaries to Gaza, Turkish militaries to Gaza, Turkish militaries to Gaza. Now, I don't think that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has any intention of sending his armies to Gaza to fight Israel. But he made it clear that he believes that Israel is no longer a state. It's what was translated as a group, almost like a gang. And he lamented the end of the Ottoman Empire a century ago, which included lands such as Gaza and included major cities throughout the Middle East, such as he mentioned Aleppo, which is in Syria. And he compared those cities to major cities in Turkey, saying there's no difference between Gaza and Gaziantep, which is a city in Turkey, saying that both of those cities belong under the Turkish umbrella just as much as the other, just as much as any other. So Erdogan making it very clear what his intentions are for the state of Turkey. That is that he sides with the jihadists. He came out last week and said clearly that Hamas are not terrorists. They are what he called mujahideen, fighting for the freedom of their people. Turkey has hosted Hamas leadership for over a decade and gone as far as to provide both diplomatic shelter for them and provide intelligence for them. So Erdogan making it very clear he sides with the jihadists, against the Western world, against Israel. And he made it very clear which side he's on in this conflict. And so I think what we can begin to see in Turkey and the way that this 3-week-old conflict has begun to have a ripple effect throughout the region is that it has solidified the prophetic picture of Daniel 11. We've seen in the Muslim states in the north, in Turkey, in Syria, which has always been an enemy of the state of Israel, continues to be, in Iraq, where a very prominent Shia politician yesterday called for the expulsion of U.S. forces from Iraq, and where a law was passed last year that outlaws any kind of support for the state of Israel with the penalty of death. Obviously, we know where Iran stands. Obviously, we know where the Taliban in Afghanistan stands and where Pakistan stands. So literally every modern nation that falls within the borders of the historical territory of the Seleucid Empire, the King of the North Empire of Daniel 11, every single one of those nations is hostile to Israel, and increasingly so as a result of this conflict. So I think one of the ways things have shifted in the region in a watershed way, in a no turning back way, is that we can continue to see these lines, these prophetic lines of antagonism and support for Israel being solidified in the Middle East. In the South, we've seen very much the opposite. The UN ambassador for the UAE, United Arab Emirates, spoke at the UN the other day, condemning Hamas and in support of Israel. The Saudi Arabian foreign minister spoke out several times yesterday, giving a history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that was very honest and very favorable towards the Israelis, and stating that the efforts for a normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel must continue. So, although those peace efforts were put on pause temporarily in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, it's clear that the Saudis have intentions to continue it forward. And the attempts to derail those talks have failed. And so we can continue to see these lines between the biblical kings of the north and south to continue to be drawn. Egypt had a huge military parade the other day. Egypt, which is the center of the king of the south empire, prophetically speaking, which has had a peace agreement with Israel for over 40 years, had a massive military parade and published a video of it just last week, making it clear that, at least as far as they're concerned, they're ready for conflict in the region. There was an incident just a couple days ago where Houthi rebels in Yemen fired some rockets in the direction of Israel, missed, and hit Egypt. The Houthi rebels are funded and supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So it seems at almost every turn at this point, every development is solidifying this prophetic landscape that we see in Daniel 11 of conflict between the north and the south. It isn't just about Israel. It has Israel in the center of it. But if you read through Daniel 11, there is an ongoing rivalry between these kings of the north and the south. And the war just isn't against Israel. The war is against these two kings. And if you begin at where we would begin, at looking in the future when the contemptible man arises at verse 21 in Daniel 11, you see a whole series of wars, at least 3 major conflicts between these two kings. So we can expect at some point after this contemptible man arises for there to be a major war in the Middle East. Doesn't mean there's not going to be one before that, but certainly after that. As the Wire has reported previously, the USS Gerald R. Ford is already in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's a major carrier strike group. Another one is, I saw today, just crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean Sea. That's USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. Both of these are massive aircraft carriers. The Gerald R. Ford is the newest and largest nuclear carrier in the U.S. fleet. Both of them have probably a dozen support ships, destroyers, command and control, submarines. So we're talking on the order of around 15,000 American naval personnel. That's not including other NATO partners that have military assets in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I've referenced the ships of Qatim several times. We've reposted our article about that several times on X. I would highly encourage everyone that hasn't read the article to do so. It explains how the ships of the Western world fit the biblical character of the ships of Qatim and how important they will be, again, in that Daniel 11 narrative, and opposing, but ultimately being overcome by the king of the north. Over 2,000 U.S. Marines now redeployed from the Strait of Hormuz, where they were patrolling the waters that Iran was causing problems in, or is still causing problems in, redeployed to the Israeli theater. About a dozen air defense batteries, THAAD, high altitude missile defense, and also Patriot missile batteries redeployed, all with supporting personnel throughout the region, Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Syria. there have been at least 20 attacks on U.S. military bases in mostly Iraq and also in Syria, eastern Syria, over the past week and a half. At least 20 U.S. personnel injured, many with traumatic brain injuries, concussions as a result of kamikaze drone strikes from Iranian proxies. And so obviously at this point, this conflict is threatening to become much more than just the Gaza front or even something within Israel. This is the point at which we're beginning to see all of these different pieces of the tinderbox catching sparks, and which threaten to take the whole region into a massive war that will undoubtedly involve the United States and NATO partners, undoubtedly involve Iran and other nations. Russia already has a military presence there. So we don't yet know how big or how widespread or how severe or intense this conflict is going to become. But we are definitely, with each day, we're seeing escalations and tensions ratcheting up further and further, both in the region and across the world, on the streets of cities in the Western world, in the Middle East. So all that to say, I think now more than ever is the time for us as believers to be setting our hearts. The most recent article I wrote called a strong delusion, I talked at the end about how Jesus set his face towards Jerusalem. And when that time had come for him to lay down his life, he settled it in his heart and he set his face towards it. And I don't know that all of us are necessarily headed towards martyrdom. Some of us are. But I think in a sense, we all need to set our face towards Jerusalem right now. Towards the new Jerusalem. Towards the Jerusalem that comes with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords when he returns. So it has been very easy for me, and I know probably for many of you, to feel, with all the things that we've seen over the past 3 weeks, to feel anger, to feel despair, to feel a sense of helplessness. There's nothing we can do about it except watch it unfold, and all these horrible things are happening. And I think that's the point at which we, and I'm preaching to myself just as much as any of you, need to settle in our hearts to set our face towards Jerusalem. We need to go gather with the saints every week and intercede harder and sing and praise and worship harder and read the Word more deeply, drink from the well of the Word of God more deeply than ever, and go about the business of making disciples, not only in our community, but investing in holding the rope for those who are making disciples among the unreached and unengaged. That's how we fight this war. Now, I'm not a pacifist. If you're in law enforcement or if you're in the military, then you're mandated and commissioned by the state, whatever state you may be in, to do the work that you do. And so God bless you in doing it. But as believers in the churches, this is our time to fight the war that we've been called to fight. And that is to take the gospel of the kingdom to every tribe, nation, language, and tongue. So I pray that you would join us in that effort. As always, the work that we're continuing to do in Israel and in Iraqi Kurdistan is still a priority. We're still on the ground everywhere that we've been on the ground throughout the region. So we pray you would continue to join us in sowing into this work. And you would pray for our teams on the ground, that you would pray for the safety and success of the IDF in Gaza, in meeting their objectives and protecting civilian life on both sides, and that they would be successful in rooting out this scourge called Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We do pray for that, but we know that there is a bigger picture at work here. There's a larger purpose of God being accomplished. And so ultimately our prayer is, your will be done, your kingdom come. So we look forward to the day that that kingdom comes, And I pray you would join me in sowing into that work. You can go to fai.online/donate, and all the buttons are there to give to our Israeli initiatives or our other initiatives in Iraqi Kurdistan or other places throughout the region. So as always, thank you for joining us. We will continue to be vigilant and share everything we can on social media as it comes. And in the meantime, I'll continue to provide these studio updates periodically, and we'll do out-of-band updates as well as significant things take place. So love you all, blessings, and Maranatha.